Welcome back to the Star Wars Newsnet channel. Special episode today because I am joined by New York Times bestselling author and the one who has given us the latest sensation in Star Wars publishing, Tessa Gratton, author of Temptation of the Force. Tessa, how are you doing today?
I am great. I'm really happy to be here talking about Temptation now that people have had a chance to get a hold of it.
It's been pretty crazy because we do some other shows here on Star Wars Newsnet, and some of them are big book fans. And there's been different talking points about Force lore or romance in Star Wars. And so many times I've wanted to tell them, like, Temptation of the Force secrets that I knew because I read the book about a month ago and I had to just keep my mouth shut for the longest time. And so now that the book is out in the world over the next few weeks, I'm so excited to be able to actually talk about the nitty gritty. But we're going to keep this mostly spoiler free for the most part here. So this is going to be a fun conversation. I'm super excited to hear what you have to say. But let's just go ahead, throw this little, I guess, a softball to you here. But what themes, when you write for Star Wars, like what are the themes that you really try and incorporate?
In general, the thing that has always brought me back to Star Wars since I was a little kid and was a fan of particularly Return of the Jedi are hope, of course, but mostly rebellion. I was really into like the Rebel Alliance, of course. They were the good guys, but really like fighting against villainy and oppression and, these big things that has, been a really big part of not just my Star Wars fandom, but also my life in general. And so that's my favorite thing, to make sure there's some kind of rebellion going on in all of my Star Wars stories. And of course, there's lots of different nuances about that, especially in the High Republic, when there's not really an overt, like, systemic bad guy like the Empire or something like that. So it's not quite so obvious all the time who people should or shouldn't be rebelling against or what the rebellion is.
And it's fascinating because the Nile in themselves is like a rebellion against the establishments. And then you have the Jedi having to try to squash out that total anarchy. But you mentioned Return of the Jedi, and I have to ask real quick, like, are you a big Ewoks fan then?
I am a big Ewok fan. I was 4, I think, when the movie came out, and I was absolutely obsessed with the little murder teddy bears. So that was my first real Star Wars love. I even got like a teddy bear onesie pajamas and like wore it all the time. And so I was like an early cosplay.
That's incredible. That's incredible. I mean, probably the ultimate source of rebellion was the Ewoks rising up and turning out to be the greatest warriors in Star Wars. So we're talking about different themes and tones in Star Wars, and it's no secret to any that have read the book or a little familiar with where the story is going. Romance is at the heart of this one, and I really want to know, what was it like for you? Because you wrote the romance here of Avar and Elzar, but co-writing Path of Deceit and having Kevmo and Marta Rose romance, and there's very stark differences in those two. So I want to know, like, what was that like writing this romance compared to the last one you wrote in Star Wars?
It was like, in my head, they're very directly connected because ultimately both romances center around the Force and, philosophies about the Force. And, with Marta and Kevmo, it was a lot of conflicting ideas, of course, because Marta's from an anti-Force user cult and Kevmo is a Jedi who loves being a Jedi. And so, that was a real point of contention for them, despite their, attraction to each other. And then when it comes to Avar and Elzar, they pretty much like agree about the Force and probably always have for their whole relationship since they were kids. And so it was really interesting to sort of have two opposing but also mirroring relationships where, the force is at the heart, but they get to, one is conflict and the other is, but actually it's not a conflict,
Mhm.
and being able to kind of resolve those feelings in a lot of ways. And of course, I ultimately, when I was first writing Kevmo and Marta, I knew how that was going to end. And, that I don't really, because of the nature of Temptation of the Force, there's
Mhm.
no like ending, since it's
Right.
the penultimate adult novel. There's
Mhm.
still a lot more. So I wasn't really driving toward an ending so much as a culmination or coming together
Mhm.
moment.
What was it like just with you talked about Avar and Elzar being on the same page for the most part about what the Force is, but even being just on different pages and how they're feeling about that and what they're supposed to do with those actions. What was it like kind of going back and forth with both of them? Like you have one character who's like, I'm ready, the other one's not. And that's been this back and forth they've had for a while now, too.
I really enjoyed that. I was very excited when I was reading early drafts of Eye of
Mhm.
Darkness, because George did so much of the work for me when it comes
Mhm.
to Avar and like really getting her in that place. And so it was a different dynamic than I originally expected when I first was offered the chance to write Temptation of the Force. I did expect that both Avar and Elzar would still be more
Mhm.
uncertain about it. But the more I, talked with George and with everyone about what was going on with Avar, the more I knew, no, this is not the story I'm going to be telling. I'm going to be telling a story that is really kind of not quite flipped them, because in the past, when Elzar has thought he was ready, he of course wasn't really
Mhm.
ready to embrace this kind of like a real love, um, in a way that wasn't risky and boundary
Mhm.
pushing and things. I do think that Elzar didn't realize that what he wanted and what he needed weren't the same
Mhm.
in the past, and now hopefully he's coming to a place where he understands the difference between want and need and how they can be the same thing.
Mhm.
That felt confusing as I was saying it, but
No, and that brings up the further conversation, which I think the book talks about, is what is love? Because both of them, I think, have different ideas of that at times and what's driving them. And it kind of leads into that beautiful conversation that Elzar and Yoda have together, where Elzar's pretty much just asked point blank to Yoda, like, what is love? What does this mean? And I don't want to get into like exactly, what they say in there for people who haven't read it, but I thought that was just a really just beautiful moment of Elzar being vulnerable to the person who's the Grand Master of the
yeah.
Jedi, the Jedi of all Jedi. So where did that idea come from for Yoda to be the one that Elzar kind of goes to for counsel in this?
It was twofold. One being, I really wanted Elzar to have a conversation with not Avar about
Hmm.
this. Um, I needed him to start reaching out on a character level, like asking for help from people that are, farther along than he is in a lot of ways. Like literally going to his elders and being
Hmm.
like, can you help me? Instead of just flailing around or trying the way he has in the past. He's kind of been made to accept help in the past.
Hmm.
And so that was the character reason. But the more like overarching reason is part of the whole point of what I was trying to do in Temptation was to directly show the difference between the Jedi Order now and the Jedi Order
Hmm.
during the prequel trilogy, when it comes to things like this. Not love specifically or attachment specifically, though, of course, that is the point, that like the pin that I'm using. But, when anybody mentions like Jedi love stories, of course, Anakin is going to be the first name that pops in. And that,
Right.
of course, goes incredibly poorly. And the main reason I think that goes poorly, aside from like Anakin's own like personality, um,
He's got some serious issues going on there.
he does.
100%.
but he also doesn't have a support network. The
Hmm.
Jedi never offer him help emotionally with the things that he comes to them already loving or being obsessed with. They're very dismissive of his needs.
Hmm.
And so there was no way for him to go to Yoda, for
Hmm.
example, and ask these questions. He couldn't even ask the people who brought him there directly, because he
Right.
knew they were just going to say no, because
Hmm.
that's the way the Jedi Order was at the time. But Elzar still has a chance to be supported. At
Hmm.
this time, at the height of the Jedi's like glory days, when there are so many of them and they have a complicated system in place, there is a chance to actually have these kind of conversations, because the Jedi haven't tightened their grip quite so
Hmm.
much the way that they come to the deeper they get involved with the politics of the Republic, and the more they become the Republic's watchdogs, for
Hmm.
lack of a better word. And so that's really the point of that conversation with Yoda is, at a time, the Jedi could support their people in these emotional struggles in a
Hmm.
way that they lose.
And you mentioned Elzar being forced to have these conversations in the past, and a lot of that's centered around Stellan. And Stellan's now gone, and then Avar's been gone, and we saw, like you said, George Mann kind of laid the groundwork for the growth of Avar. But Elzar, he kind of gets him to this point where he's ready to start opening up a little bit. And then I love how you kind of took that and really expanded on that to where he needed that person he was willing to go to. And I just really want to applaud you on the decision of Yoda. I thought that was not something I would have expected to happen there, especially given what we know the Jedi to be. But it felt perfect in the moment. So Elzar's growth as a character here was really fun. So love, obviously, in romance is at the center of this, but also empathy is a big part of this book as well. And of course, when we think of empathy and emotions in the High Republic, we have to go to our favorite Wookiee Jedi, Burryaga. And so a question for you I have is, just with Burryaga and Bell, like, what did you pull from to get the inspiration for not only their brotherhood, but to also further expand upon Burry's superpower of empathy, which is pretty integral to his character in this book?
I have to admit that Burryaga and Bell were less interesting to me
Hmm.
as a reader when I was reading Phase One. Um, I mean, I liked them, but I was much more pulled to some of the other
Hmm.
characters, possibly because of the intensity of feelings
Hmm.
and politics coming from like Avar and Elzar and Stellan and Markian and the villains. But I knew some of the revelations, like some of the things that I needed to do in Temptation, centering around the blight in particular, and a few other spoilery things. And so I decided to use Burry's point of view instead of Bell's, partly because everybody else had used Bell's and I just
Hmm.
wanted to try something a little different. And also because I really wanted to be able to dig into what that empathy feels like for Burry, particularly because he's a step removed from most Jedi, even because of language barriers and
Hmm.
things like that, which are, it's a big theme for him. And I was playing around with how to really unlock that. And I read Charles's short story in Tales of Light and Life, which is about what happens to Burry and Bell in the immediate
Hmm.
aftermath of the fall of Starlight Beacon. And it was so horrifying to me to think about Burryaga in that situation,
Mm-hmm.
and what he was going through, and what he had to do to survive and to
Right.
hold on to any hope at all. Um, and then, of course, Belle, who was also going through a lot, obviously, and refusing to let go just as
Mm-hmm.
intensely as Buryaga, from opposite ends. Burry was refusing to give up hope that someone would get his messages, and Belle was refusing to give up hope that Burry might
Mm-hmm.
still be alive. And so it was this like stubbornness that they both share that is what I think I tried to pull on, even though their stubbornness doesn't show up a ton directly in
Mm-hmm.
temptation. That's really what unlocked their relationship to me, is this loyalty, and like an almost stubborn loyalty they've developed toward each other, by repeated exposure to danger, basically.
Right. It
um,
reminded me of a lot of like Jedi relationships that we see throughout like Clone Wars, that these Jedi are going to work together a lot on these missions, and like that brotherhood that gets formed there. And with Burry, just being able to read this book, and we haven't really had Burry's perspective much. Like you mentioned, most of it's told through Belle's perspective.
mhm.
It was a bit challenging at first, because I felt like I was being introduced to this character that I thought I knew for the first time, because I'm getting more of his own thoughts. And it was very rewarding, because it felt like I finally have this fleshed out version of Burry's character.
I'm
So
really glad
that
to
was
hear that.
fascinating.
Yeah.
And so, and it was fascinating. Like as a teacher, I have a lot of students that maybe speak different languages or come from different backgrounds, of course. And so Burry's language barrier part, and sometimes his frustration at not being understood, kind of related to me, as like, I probably have students in the room that might be getting frustrated by not feeling understood, but you have someone like Belle that's reaching out, really trying to connect. I thought that was like a really just poignant move by you in this book. So I thought that was fantastic. Thank you for that, by the way.
Yeah. Thank you.
And
I'm
so,
glad.
okay. So we've talked about all the good guys. That's wonderful. Everyone loves a good hero. Let's get to what everyone really loves, though, and that's the villains. So you're in a unique position here, because you've written Yana Rowe, you've written Marta Rowe, and you've now written a Markian Rowe story as well. And so before I talk specifically about Markian, I want to know, of the three Rows, which is your favorite to dive into?
Marta.
Mm-hmm.
That's easy.
100%. It's easy.
Yep.
So we do a podcast called The Timeline Show. We just, the episode that came out actually this morning was on Tales of Light and Life, with the A Close Fist Has No Claws with Marta that you wrote. And that one, probably the most shaking story I think I've maybe ever read in Star Wars, just by what happens to her from the beginning of her story to the end. And I know that this is a phase 3 book, and we started with Marta in phase 2. But could you talk about why you love Marta so much, as opposed to maybe the other Rows?
I partly, she was my first. Path of Deceit was my first High Republic book, and I really got to dig into her, particularly as we already discussed a little bit, and her relationship with Kevmo, and all that Force philosophy. I love weird Force stuff.
Mm.
I love arguing about the Force. And I also, most of my books before I started working for the High Republic were young adult novels. I have a couple of adult fantasies, but for the most part, my writing home has been in YA. And I love a really, messy teenager who is, really trying to figure themselves out, and making choices. And Marta was the first time in a while that I was writing a messy teenager who I knew ultimately was going to choose violence,
Right.
basically choose to go down a very dark and dangerous path, and a path where she's not prioritizing compassion or hope or relationships or things like that.
Mm-hmm.
And so it was very fascinating to me as a writer to figure out, how do I make her, like, I really wanted her to be intensely lovable. And I wanted readers to be like, oh my God, this character is so interesting. I can't believe
Mm-hmm.
she's going to go on this journey. But at the same time, I wanted readers to be able to see hints of, oh no, actually, I can see
Mm-hmm.
how, she can get obsessive, or how she can be easily manipulated, and like things like that. So it was really cool to be delving into that aspect of Marta. If I had come to her when she was already an adult, I don't know that I would feel the
Mm-hmm.
same way about her.
Okay.
Yeah.
No, that's fascinating. So you're talking about getting into the first Rose that, we meet in the High Republic and how messy that is. What about that do you think strengthened you going into writing a Markian Rose story? Like, what about that just really kind of gave you the extra oomph to really delve out his pretty devious acts in this book, to say the least?
Yeah, I think that Markian is essentially a genius psychopath.
Hmm.
And I don't think Marta is either of those things. And what I mean by like genius is that I think Markian sees steps beyond what most people see, just
Hmm.
like that. A lot of people will have to be like, okay, I think this will happen, and then this will happen, and then this will happen, and then this will happen. But Markian jumps from point A to point F immediately, and like then he can jump from point F to point Z. And that is what I mean by like the way his brain works, I think,
Hmm.
is like kind of a genius. And then he just is devoid of emotional connection in a lot of ways. And I am not sure whether I think he made himself that way, or he was born that way, or a combination of
Hmm.
both. Obviously, his dad didn't help with that, because his dad was
Asgar was not the best father. He,
right,
he
right.
had some shortcomings there.
Exactly. So Markian's, tendencies toward lack of compassion were encouraged, and
Hmm.
even like co-created maybe by his family situation. But so I do think in a lot of ways I was writing the opposite of Marta, but also someone who could have come from her
Mm.
nevertheless. So, yeah. And I do also really like the Evereni lore in general. I like digging into them and thinking, okay, well, what are their tendencies as a species? And what might an Evereni who is cut off from other Evereni be like if Markian has this kind of like love hate relationship
Mhm.
with, well, I know what I am, but they've never given me anything. So, what of the Evereni do I want to claim,
Mhm.
and what do I want to push away? So, a really fascinating character.
It's the whole just family line, just talking about Marta, Yana, Markian, and I'm hoping, I've been having my fingers crossed for a while that at some point we're gonna dive back into Marta's story, at some point in the future of Star Wars publishing. So if that does happen and your name is not on the cover as the author of this Marta book, there's gonna be some
Yeah,
problems. There probably gonna be some fights breaking out
I'd
amongst
love
the
to.
fans. So you talked about an aspect of Markian being how he can see from point A to point F, and then like F to Z. And there's another character, Gira, who I believe thinks that she's the same way and being able to do that. And I would say there's an interesting, there's that power struggle going on between in the Nile. And Gira kind of sees herself as an ultimate schemer as well. And so I'm curious on your end, what was it like getting into the politics of the Nile, but also with the Republic's version of that as well, Chancellor Lena So?
I love writing about politics. I originally went to graduate school to go into politics. I was going to be a feminist lobbyist and change the world by politics, until I realized that real world politics are terrible actually,
Mm,
and were turning me into a less good person.
mm,
um, but I still love writing about them, and I love mirroring, the horrible mess that politics can become in my writing. And I like doing it in a place like Star Wars, where you do actually still have a lot of really clear cut lines. In real world politics, there are not a lot of clear cut lines. There are
mhm,
some, but in Star Wars, there are a lot. And so you can um, make points via politics in a much cleaner, more specific way, I
mhm,
think. And so I was really excited to be able to do that on like the galactic level, because that's really something that's harder to do in the young adult and middle grade books, which are my previous High Republic
mhm.
books were. So I didn't really have that window into the galactic politics that was so wide open as I could do with Gira and Lena. So, and even Elzar in this book to a
Mhm.
certain extent.
Who do you think is the best schemer in the High Republic then? Like political schemer then?
Oh, the best political schemer, Xylan.
Oh my goodness. Why are all the graphs so messy? Like why are all the graphs so
Yeah,
messy?
because that's the way I like him.
They're just it seems every at the root of every problem in the High Republic there is like a graph not far behind.
Yep.
And Silent. Talk about Silent then for a minute. We're talking you just mentioned him. Like what was it like getting into that character?
I was really excited to do that. I've loved him ever since I read Out of the Shadows by Justina
Mhm.
Ireland. And when we were talking about how we were going to write Defy the Storm and who we were going to use. And I was like, Justina, please, please let me write Xylan Graf. And she was like, what? He's the worst. And I said, by which you mean the best. Um, she thought that she was writing Jordana for me, like that would be my favorite character.
Oh,
And I
okay.
do really love Jordana. She's great. But it's Xylan. And I love writing him because, first of all, he's really easy for me to write. There's just something about that kind of character who is, makes bad choices on purpose, but does it with flair and, with a lot of schemes in
Mhm.
mind. And he just lights up scenes. And I really wanted to pull him into Temptation because I knew Temptation was not going to have a lot of humor.
Mhm.
And it was, everybody's really going through it in phase 3. And the Temptation has a lot of the darkest emotional
Mhm.
points in the phase. And I was like, I just have to have somebody who can just burst into a scene and be like, okay, we can have a good time for 5 minutes. And so that's the reason I really pulled him in.
And it is
And
fun. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
oh, I was just going to say, through him, I got to have a lot of Care Santeca, and Care's my rebel. I
Mhm.
wanted to put a rebel into Temptation of the Force the same way that I've always loved rebellions and rebels in all of Star Wars.
Mhm. And the two of them together make such a unique pair and everyone that it's funny watching everyone's reactions when they discover that the two of them are together like you two like not only you have the family dynamic but they're so different in terms of you have Care willing to risk everything to help the people and then Xylan who's like we're gonna make sure me and my dog are okay first and
Yep.
then we'll see what we can do. He certainly has a flair for the dramatic but even beyond the humor, there I think you do a great job of putting in little pieces where the mask gets lifted just for a moment and then he has to like put it right back on. And I think that's not always easy to do with a character like Xylan who has to portray that specific part of himself to
Yeah.
everyone.
And, one of the reasons I do think that ultimately he is the best schemer, at least in Temptation, is because he is the one who is the most terrified by Markian Rowe.
Hmm.
He's the one who really sees what Markian is capable of. He's the one who's like, you guys don't understand. You always have to assume the worst, and then even worse than you can possibly imagine, because that's who Markian Rowe is. And nobody else really puts that into words in such a way as Xylan. And
Hmm.
so he is not anywhere near on Markian's level, but he is close enough he can see it and
Hmm.
be terrified of it.
He, if anyone's gonna be terrified too, it's definitely Xylon, especially when
Yeah,
you threaten the dog, when
right.
you threaten his pet. He's like, I'm terrified of anyone who's gonna send people in to murder my dog. But you
Yeah.
talked about that darkness that is within a lot of temptation, and Porter Ingle has a big time inner struggle and inner battle going on in this book, completely related to General Vice. I want to just ask you, can you spend a moment talking about this inner conflict that's going on within him? Because the two of them this is like a generational long conflict between the two of them. And I thought it was really fascinating seeing that just continue to be amplified for over 100 years at this point.
Yeah. For Porter, when I came into all of the characters that I was going to be using, I was trying to like thematically tie them all to love, because that is like
Mhm,
the core of the book itself.
mhm,
And for Porter, the reason that he has, such a almost obsession with General Vice, and getting revenge or facing her again, at least,
mhm,
is because Vice took away the person that he loved most.
mhm,
And even though she didn't literally do that, it was their encounters that caused Barash to leave.
mhm,
And so I think that it really is about his Porter's own relationship with love that he doesn't even really know how to acknowledge, partly because of how he has survived for so long, and his relationship with the Force and all that kind of stuff. But I think that is his actual biggest. Um, he really needs to deal with that, and he won't be able to really come out of whatever ultimate conflict or
mhm,
showdown he has with General Vice if he doesn't really understand where that's coming from.
mhm.
So good luck, Charles, good luck, Porter.
Yeah, well, the way that I Have Darkness left, it's a little bit ambiguous what happens to Porter, and I always felt like that's not how he's gonna die, right? And then so like on the first page of Temptation, when like Porter is chilling on the first page, I did leave out a fist pump, and I was like, yes, like the blade, we're gonna get some blade of Bardata in this one.
Yeah.
Uh,
I originally, you didn't find out that Porter survived until like a third of the way through
mm.
Temptation in my first draft. And the editor at Random House Worlds, Tom Holler, was like, I think this needs to be the prologue. And I was like, but what? There's so much tension. Avar doesn't know, so nobody
Mhm,
should know. But I was convinced, and I do think that it is now the best way to have opened the
mhm,
book, to just get that out of the way and then like tease what's to come with Porter instead.
mhm. I'm trying to think what I would have done, like what my reaction would have been if I'm a third of the way through, like a couple hundred pages now, and then suddenly Porter Ingle, is there. I'm trying to
Mhm.
think about how big of a fist pump would have
It
happened.
was the scene is still in the book when he bursts in on Naboo. I'll just
Hmm.
leave it there. So
Okay,
when that happens, which is sort of a surprise entrance, that
great.
was his first appearance.
That would have been magnificent for sure. But I think even having him at the beginning, then it's almost like like you said, there's so much darkness within this novel, and there's a lot of heavy things. So to start off with letting everyone take almost, I kind of took a deep breath and then like exhaled after I saw. He's like, all right, something good to start off. Like
Yep.
he's alive. Then of course he gets into like, or like, oh boy, he's going through it upstairs.
Yep.
So it
Yep.
got dark quickly. But what do you hope people take away from Temptation?
I do hope that people really come away with, my understanding at least of the relationship between love and relationships and the Force in
Mhm,
general. It's been a big beef I've had with the Jedi my whole life, expecting people to let go of everything. I've never really been able to reconcile how you're supposed to truly believe in justice if you don't love something.
mhm,
And the dismissing love as attachment has always just not really, it hasn't sat well with me. And so I really am glad I got to write a whole novel as a thesis statement
mm,
about what I think the Jedi should think actually about love. So I ultimately I hope that is what people take away, is that, and it's not just
mhm,
romantic love, but all the different kinds of love that are like kind of
mhm,
showcased, particularly through the Jedi characters,
mhm.
but not exclusively.
So if I am taking a graduate course on Star Wars, like romance, like I don't have to write the paper, for my everything. I just put temptation up and I just present them. This is Tessa Gratton's Temptation of the Force. Here you go.
Exactly.
Easy A, easy A.
Exactly.
So I something I love in the High Republic though is all of the different relationships that we see, and like both romantic relationships, whether it be starting in phase two, you have Kevmo and and Marta, but you have Fontu and Ziri and some of the adult novels. Of course, Avar Elzar, like my favorite ever, of course. But even beyond that, you have like the Brotherhood of Bell and Burry, and how you mentioned before, just they so strongly care for one another. And that's something that is missing. I think that's, you make a great point, that's missing in other aspects of Star Wars storytelling regarding the Jedi, that is really important to this era, and I think makes this era stand out amongst all the others. So we're far from finished with the High Republic publishing initiative. We still have, Charles is going to finish it all off in next summer, but right now, as we're in the thick of the final phase, when you all of this is done, what are you specifically going to look back and like cherish or remember most about being involved in this massive like publishing initiative?
It's really twofold. First of all, the way that all of us writers, and the
Mhm,
editorial team and Mike, just how dynamic the process is. Like, it is so different from everything else I've ever written,
mhm,
whether it was co-writing or also in some other way collaborative, because it's so um, like there's so many peaks and valleys of what is working easily and what we have to have like meeting
mhm,
after meeting after meeting to just really like untangle, because we're all dealing with the same thing in three different books and one of the comics,
mhm,
just like making sure all the different angles, we've got the different levels of perspective and everything. It's just been so fascinating, and I've learned a lot about writing, like my own writing
mhm,
process, and that is just absolutely invaluable to me, as a writer. um, but then on a more personal level, really the readers, the fan response to the High Republic is like nothing I've ever experienced as a creator. And it's even, of course, it's very different even from the fandoms I'm in as a fan. But the art and the creativity and the love and excitement is just incredible.
mhm.
And all I have to do if I'm having a bad day is just like, oh, but there are some High Republic readers out there who they really liked that one thing that we did, and they told us about
Mhm.
it, and that was really nice. And seeing just such a variety of fans all over, it's just absolutely incredible.
Mhm. And it's remarkable just how many like threads are woven together throughout all of the High Republic. You'll be reading a comic issue 6 that, Cavan Scott is writing, and there's tie-ins to things that you're writing in Path of Deceit or other, novels that are out there. But it feels as if each individual project and Temptation of the Force, this was really hard to do. I truly think if someone had not picked up a High Republic book before, they could open Temptation and there's different elements they might be missing, but they're right away going to understand the heart behind Elzar and Avar's relationship, and they're gonna get this struggle that's going on. And I almost feel like it just is the perfect balance of you can jump in anywhere you want in this timeline while also enjoying the interconnectedness of it all. And was that a
I'm really
challenge,
glad.
like
Oh,
writing
yeah.
Temptation and making it appeal to like that whole group of people that's written or wrote read everything, and also the people that are jumping in maybe for one of the first times.
It was really challenging. I did a lot of homework for it. I'd of course already read all of the books and
Mhm.
most of the comics. But when I was developing Temptation, I went back through and I reread everything with like a pencil and sticky notes and, marked
Mhm.
things like here, this is a throwaway line, but it is indicative of, you know, something that Buryaga felt when
Mhm.
he was he was still a Padawan, but even younger.
Right.
And here is something that Stellan thought that actually is about Avar, I
Mhm.
think. So let me like put all this stuff into my thoughts, and also remembering what actually
Mhm.
happened as opposed to what we all talk about in our
Mhm.
big meetings, but what like what we think was going to happen. um, and so all of that was really fresh in my mind, and I was trying to find the most like top level way of bringing it the biggest threads in, so that I could focus on the personal reactions to that and like the character's perspective. And I think that is what allowed me to do the job that I did, was not trying to explain everything, but like,
Mhm.
this is where Burry is, and this is what he thinks about this. And really that's all
Mhm.
anybody needs to know to understand where Burry is now, what Burry is doing now, and where he is trying to get.
Mhm.
And then the same with the other characters, like no extraneous information, but just enough about what is important to them in each moment.
Mhm.
I think that is what allowed me to pull all the threads together that I
Mhm.
did. And then as far as keeping the book itself as as like a standalone
Mhm.
story as possible, I really have to shout out again to Tom Holer at Random House Worlds, because he continually brought me back to that and helped me remember, okay, but what matters for this book? What
Mhm.
matters for this book? This is the story you're trying to tell. What do you need to do to tell that story to make this a satisfying read? Where, of course, people are going to want to know what happens immediately
Right.
after the last paragraph of Temptation of the Force. And of course, people will want to, read the short story about what actually happened to Burry, and Eye of Darkness, and Defy the Storm with Vernestra and what she was going
Mhm.
through. But ultimately, how can we make it so that they don't have to, and
Mhm.
still find this to be a satisfying story? So
Mhm.
Tom really helped me focus on that.
That's incredible. I think there is a very just great balance struck throughout the book. So you definitely nailed it in terms of what you were shooting for there. A couple of quick hitters before we close out. Number
Okay.
one, favorite High Republic Jedi.
Oh, Burry now. I wouldn't have
Okay.
said that before, but Burryaga, I really fell for him.
That surprises me, like based off of everything, but I guess it makes sense given that you were like, I'm gonna tell this from Burry's perspective and not Bell's. Okay. Favorite Star Wars villain, not just High Republic, just Star Wars villain.
Oh, gosh. Oh, probably Darth Vader. Anakin.
Yes, you can't go
Yeah,
wrong.
classic.
You can't go wrong there.
Yeah.
You have a Star Wars pet. You can have any pet in Star Wars. What's your ideal Star Wars pet companion?
I do think I would love a giant snow dog. It couldn't live here because it's too hot here, but it would just be so nice.
Would you move specifically so you could have the snow dog? No,
No,
so
no,
it's
I
just a
like
pipe
where I live.
tree.
Yeah.
That's fantastic. Okay, last one. It's summertime. Where are you going on vacation in the Star Wars galaxy?
I do want to go to Naboo. That's one of the reasons
Mhm,
I picked it, is because I know what it looks like and it's got so many different kinds of environments. It's beautiful. It's
mhm,
hard to beat the landscapes in Attack of the Clones.
mhm. And then last thing, this is not Star Wars quick hitter. You mentioned other fandoms you're a part of. What are those? I'm curious. What are some other fandoms
Oh,
we love?
I'm a huge fan of the Untamed, which is a sea drama,
Okay.
and it was a web novel originally called The Grandmaster of Demonic Cultivation,
Okay.
and it is delightful. I really got into that during the pandemic, and I've moved on to some of the author's other works
Mm.
also. So I really, really recommend the ridiculousness and like surprisingly sweet chaos of a book called The Scum Villain Self-Saving System.
Okay. All right, everyone, make sure you take that, mark that
Yep.
down, write that down. It's your next reading after you get done with Temptation of the Force. That's what we're gonna do next. Thank you so much for coming on and talking about Temptation today. Is there anything else about the book you want to share real quick before we get out of here, or do you have anything else like coming up in the works that you'd like to, plug
Sure.
away?
I am really excited. I sold an epic fantasy trilogy. The first book is called The Mercy Makers, and it's going to come out sometime next, probably May or June.
Okay.
So a year from now, I'm really excited. It's about power and sex and empire, and how sometimes love actually doesn't save you.
Okay, so definitely some themes from Temptation that we could see expanded upon there. Sounds like another one that could be some darker moments as well
Yep.
that we see in Temptation for sure. Thank you so much, everyone. Get a copy of Temptation of the Force. If you haven't already, you're missing out. Get it as soon as you can. I made my dad. I'm gonna make my dad order it as soon as I see him here in a couple of days. He's got to get on
Excellent.
that. But Tessa, thanks for hopping on today. It was a pleasure
Of
talking with
course,
you.
thanks for having me. This was delightful.
All right, everybody. Temptation of the Force. It's out now. Go get it. We will see you next time.